When readers encounter the New Testament, the word Gentiles is usually assumed to refer broadly to all non-Israelite people. Yet when the historical and covenantal framework of the first century is examined more carefully, that assumption becomes far less certain. The apostles did not operate within a modern universal religious context, but within the specific narrative world of Israel's scriptures and Israel's prophetic hopes. Paul himself explicitly situates his message within Israel's covenant story. In Romans 9:4, he reminds his audience that the adoption as sons, and the glory, and the covenants, and the giving of the law, and the temple service, and the promises belong to Israel. The apostolic message therefore addressed a crisis that emerged within Israel's covenant history rather than a general human condition detached from that history. As the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright observes, Paul's gospel is the announcement that the long story of Israel has reached its climax in the Messiah. Source: Wright, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, page 802. The prophetic background reinforces this framework. The Hebrew prophets repeatedly describe Israel as scattered among the nations and absorbed into foreign lands. Hosea speaks of Israel being swallowed up among the nations. Hos 8:8, while Ezekiel describes Israel as dispersed throughout the countries. Ezek 3:6-19. In such a context, it was entirely possible for Israelites living among the nations to be socially regarded as Gentiles within the Greco-Roman world. Second Temple scholars frequently note the complexity of identity within the diaspora. Shea J.D. Cohen, in his study of Jewish identity in antiquity, writes, "In the diaspora, the boundaries between Jew and Gentile were often blurred, and the synagogue world included a range of sympathizers and participants who stood somewhere between full Jews and pagans." Source: Cohen, The Beginnings of Jewishness, page 140. This observation creates an important logical boundary. If the Mosaic Law, the covenant curses, and the prophetic promises of restoration belong specifically to Israel, then the gospel message addressing those covenant conditions would naturally concern people already connected to that covenant framework. The message proclaimed by Jesus and the apostles addressed Israel's covenant crisis and the promised restoration spoken of by the prophets. For that reason, before asking who the Gentiles in Paul's letters were, we must first ask who they could not have been. They could not have been people entirely outside Israel's covenant narrative with no relationship to its law, promises, or prophetic expectations. Understanding the historical setting clarifies why the New Testament consistently frames its message within Israel's story rather than presenting it as a timeless program directed toward all humanity. This framework is also reflected in the geographical pattern of Paul's missionary activity. Paul's journeys did not represent an indiscriminate global outreach. Instead, he consistently traveled to cities that contained established Jewish communities and synagogues. These communities formed the primary platform from which the message spread. As historian Wayne Meeks explains, the earliest Christian mission spread along the network of Jewish diaspora, communities that already existed throughout the cities of the Mediterranean. Source: The First Urban Christians, page 11. These synagogue communities were not composed solely of Jews. They included proselytes and God-fearers, non-Jews who revered Israel's God and participated in synagogue life. The presence of these groups created a social environment in which people attached to Israel's religious tradition were already familiar with the scriptures and the hope of Israel's restoration. Louis Feldman, a leading scholar of diaspora Judaism, summarizes the phenomenon this way: the synagogue attracted numerous Gentiles who admired Jewish monotheism and ethics. These God-fearers formed a significant constituency within the synagogue orbit. Source: Feldman, Jew and Gentile in the Ancient World, page 342. Within this setting, Paul's first audience was always the synagogue. Acts repeatedly describes Paul entering synagogues and reasoning from the Scriptures. His initial audience, therefore, consisted of Jews and proselytes, individuals already regarded as members of Israel's religious community. When opposition arose, Paul sometimes declared that he would turn to the Gentiles, but this shift occurred within the same synagogue context. The book of Acts repeatedly illustrates this mixed synagogue audience. Luke frequently distinguishes between Jews and devout Greeks, or God-fearing Greeks, who were present together in the synagogue environment per Acts 13:43, 17:4, and 17:12. These individuals were not typical pagans with no knowledge of Israel's God. Rather, they were people who had already attached themselves to Israel's religious life. Craig Seskina notes this important detail. God-fearers were Gentiles attracted to Jewish monotheism and ethics who attended synagogues and honored Israel's God without fully converting to Judaism. Source: Keener, Acts, an exegetical commentary, Volume 2, page 1734. This pattern helps explain Paul's citation of Isaiah 49 when describing his mission to the Gentiles. In its original prophetic context, Isaiah is speaking about the restoration of Israel itself, to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back the preserved of Israel. The servant becomes a light to the nations precisely through the restoration of Israel. The biblical scholar Richard Bauckham highlights this point. The mission to the nations in the New Testament emerges from Israel's own restoration and vocation as the servant people of God. Source: Bauckham, Bible and Mission, page 47. When Paul applies this prophecy to his own work, per Acts 13:47, he places his outreach squarely within Israel's prophetic restoration narrative rather than outside of it. Seen in this historical light, the Gentiles Paul encountered were individuals already connected to Israel's religious world. Some were God-fearers like Cornelius, people who honored Israel's God and participated in synagogue life. Others may have been diaspora Israelites, who were socially regarded as Gentiles within the Greco-Roman environment. Still others were proselytes who had formally joined Israel's covenant community. What emerges from this evidence is a picture quite different from the modern assumption that Paul was simply launching a universal religion detached from Israel's story. Instead, Paul understood his mission as the announcement that Israel's long-awaited restoration had begun and that those attached to Israel's covenant world, both scattered Israelites and those already aligned with Israel's God, were now being gathered into that restoration. In that sense, Paul's outreach to the Gentiles was not the abandonment of Israel's story, but its continuation. The message he proclaimed was that the prophetic hope of Israel's renewal was unfolding among the scattered and the attached within Israel's covenant world.